Well, first of all, thank you very much for the organization of this event. I think the topic could not be more timely. And I feel especially honored to be able to break the ice in today's conference by hosting this very first panel. I'm here surrounded by a group of very diverse experts who are going to try to shed light on the topic of where is the line between cyber conflict and cyber war. And because I'm not the important person of this panel, I just want to say a couple of words about this topic. And that is that cyber has become cyber has been one of the main topics on the agenda for the past few years. And honestly, it couldn't be in any other way. But I still remember when we were still discussing whether cyber war was a legitimate topic that we should all be discussing. And it really looks like as of now, we really should be trying to define what it is. Definitions matter because it helps us create limits, informs policy, and sets the agenda. It is able to set which priorities should NATO and its allies respond to, and also with whom they should engage and under which terms. So in that sense, the topic of this panel is specifically that. But before that, I want to say thank you to my panelists for joining, and I would like to give the floor to them. So just like a few housekeeping rules, this panel is going to last approximately for 1 hour. Each of the panelists are gonna give their introductory remarks for around like 2-3 minutes. Then we will go on to panel discussion. And finally, I would like to finish with some 10 to 15 minutes Q&A with the audience. So if you have like any question, it would be great that you would raise your hand. We will be delighted to discuss on that. So we will start with Alexander Poity, which is like Deputy Chairman of the State Service of Special Communications and Information Protection in Ukraine, who's going to give us an overview of what is happening like in Ukraine at the moment when it comes to cyber. Then we will move on to Mr. Christian Mark Lieflander, Head of Cyber and Hybrid Policy Section at NATO, who's like going to speak a little bit about what is NATO view on this topic. And we'll move on to Dr. Monika Kaminska, Assistant Professor at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs of Leiden University. And lastly, we will have Dr. Joseph Devani, Lecturer in War Studies and Deputy Director of the Center of Defense Studies at King's College London. The floor is yours, Alexander. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to grateful your country and your people and your government for supporting Ukraine in this hard time. Ukraine really very grateful for this support. And today, a representative State Service Special Communication and Protect Information Service responsible for cybersecurity in Ukraine and the security critical infrastructure. And I would like to say a couple of words about a main question, this discussion, where different between cyber conflict and cyber war, and where we have border between this entity, these things, and so on. First of all, we have a bad experience today in Ukraine for bad experience about cyber attacks. We have a lot of cyber incident every day. Our response team registered this cyber incident, and day of day we have a huge cyber attack. For example, before the invasion, in January, we have a very big cyber attack of government resource. This is a lot of website of government agencies was by the face. After this, a lot of state register not will destroy, but have interruptions in the work for give citizen of Ukraine public service. Next cyber attack was in Viasat system, and Europe country know about this attack because a lot of citizen of Europe has interrupted service of Viasat services. So where is difference between cyber conflict and cyber war. In my opinion, first things, when the goals of cyber attacks become not material and financial goals, but social and political goals. This is the first condition. What these goals may be? The first, to destabilize the social political situation in full country and, for example, different regional into country. The second, they achieve their political goals. For example, compromising election, for example, electronic election in other countries, different level, national level, local level, and so on. And third, to create a social tension by means of launch strikes of the critical infrastructure sites. Second, when we know a lot of different groups, hackers, who work and realize different cyber incidents, cyber attacks. When these group hackers support financial, technical, logistical support government, that we have cyber war, because this hackers group work to political goals, not financial or material goals and so on. So government pay these cyber attacks. Third, last weeks I was in OSCE conference and we discussed CBMs, confidence build measures. This is infographic about CBMs. OSCE developed 16 different rules for responsible behavior different countries in cyberspace. But today, this confidence building measure not good work. Because the country, for example, Russian Federation, destroy this building measures. When the Rubicon is crossed, when a state violates this publicity accepted norms of behavior of cyberspace. So this is three main conditions when we don't have cyber conflict, but start have cyber war. Political goals, social political tension for citizens, and violate confidence building measures. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Alexander. I think that you very systematically responded to the question, and I would like to give the floor to Mr. Liplander, because I would like to know a little bit more what NATO thinks about that and what NATO thinks about this specific topic of cyber war in relation to Ukraine, perhaps, if we may.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me here. Good morning to you all. I'd like to look at two issues in my brief remarks this morning. First is how to think about cyber, because I think this is important if you want to do something about cyber. And indeed, that's going to be the second part of my remarks. I'm going to have to be intellectually honest with you, because I sometimes find the whole dichotomy between war and peace a bit difficult. It sort of conveys the point that there's peace and then suddenly there is war. And I don't really think that this is the case when it comes to cyber. Lucas Kello, whom you will have later in one of the panels, I think has described this sort of continuum as unpeace, right? But really conveying the notion that it can be difficult to understand what we're dealing with. I guess sort of the way to think about it is it's a permanently contested domain. And as highlighted by the DCM this morning, quite often those malicious actors that pursue these activities deliberately design around deterrence, deliberately stay really below the threshold of an armed attack. So I think the sort of the closest that we have come, and you've seen us using that term quite often, is the notion of strategic competition. In other words, that is something that is continuous, that cyberspace is always on, and that indeed has profound implications for your capability development, for the kind of organizational structure you need, the kind of training and education your people need. So that's why perhaps not necessarily the cyber war, but a strategic competition then, by using all available means, and cyberspace itself to gain an advantage as part of that sort of strategic competition. So always on, and not necessarily about a single incident or a response to an incident. I think we have made it quite clear that sometimes these campaigns last for years, right? So you really have to look at not only the single incident that breaks the camel's back, so to speak, but the cumulative effect of these campaigns that sometimes take years and take a long time. And that's a way to then signal back to the potential adversary what is acceptable or unacceptable behavior in that space. So that's why I think it's important to get that first piece right of how do we think about that dichotomy, war, peace, and what does that mean when it comes to how we should posture ourselves. Now the second part, so if the first one is how do we think about it, what do we do about it would be the second question. And to me, I'd really like to sort of thank our Ukrainian colleague for setting the stage, because I think what the Ukraine case tells us is that, yes, it is possible to defend yourself even against an adversary as capable as the Russian Federation. In other words, the defender also has a role to play in this regard. And that's why, to me, perhaps the sort of the notion of resilience is so important, right? You're probably not going to be able to defend everything, everywhere, all of the time, but the notion that you should be able to suffer the blow and get back to action as quickly as possible, I mean, that's what it really sort of boils down to. So the defense also has something to say when it comes to that sort of offense-defense dynamic. And it's a choice quite often, right? Because to me, it's not a one-off investment. It's not a one-off capability. It's if, going back to my previous piece, if cyberspace is always on, then your defense needs to be always on. It's common for those of you that have served or are familiar with the military technology or military thinking, it's the OODA loop, right? You do things, you observe how they behave, you improve, and off you go again. So that's why, yeah, I mean, this sort of notion of resilience is so important. And like I said, there's a choice in this regard. If there's one more thing that I would like to emphasize, I think that's the role of industry, and that has sort of come through very clearly in the conflict, in the war that we are observing. Now, we've been talking about it for years. There's public-private partnership that has always been there, but I think this time around, really the magnitude of it is quite different. But I can also tell you that we need to get out of our comfort zone. I do not expect industry to do all of these things for free long into the sunset. So we need to sort of think through of how do we collaborate with industry, who develops that technology, who uses that technology, who happens to be quite often the first responder that we also make use of. I suspect that we will not be able to get it right without actually sort of getting the modalities of that collaboration with industry right. So with that, I hope I've left plenty of breadcrumbs behind for you to follow. Thank you. Back to you.
Not only that, I already have a couple of questions for you after that. I would like to give the floor to Dr. Kaminska, because based on your research, which other lessons did you think that the war in Ukraine, the cyber conflict or war in Ukraine is like bringing to us?
Yeah, thank you so much also for having me here. Really exciting event to be part of. And yeah, I'd like to, in my remarks, sort of focus on what we've learned from Russian operations in Ukraine about cyber conflict, how some of our understandings have evolved. And largely, I think many of these understandings were in place before the war. First of all, echoing what Christian said, I think Ukraine has taught us many things in the last half a year. And one of those is that successful cyber defense is possible. So all credit to the Ukrainian CERT and its partners for that. It seems to me on looking at sort of the big question that's debated among academics and sort of panels, you know, to the ends of this earth, why have we not seen more destructive cyber attacks? That's been sort of the question on everyone's lips. And I think, you know, first of all, we have seen significant attacks as you know, it's already been discussed here. And that defense, that successful defense is not to be diminished. But I think that now, you know, if I were the Russians, I'd think, well, what's most useful to me in this war, and that's probably intelligence collection, right? So putting their cyber units, putting their cyber forces to work on that is probably going to be most useful to them. We've known for a long time that cyber capabilities are not all that useful tactically in war. It's sort of been widely accepted, as Christian was saying, that cyber operations are more useful below that threshold of war for influencing political outcomes rather than military outcomes. And in this sense, I think the term strategic competition is indeed particularly useful. One thing that we see time and again in Russian operations, and this is what fascinates me the most, is that Russia really likes to use cyber capabilities to sow chaos, and it's particularly good at that. This has always been part of its modus operandi in Ukraine. Much of this chaos was, of course, due to lack of preparation, and we saw that also with the conventional forces. But part of it, I think, is also cultural, and part of it is very much by design. So Russian operations are particularly distinct in that they have always a psychological function, whether it's signaling capability to leadership or undermining public confidence or morale. Often they just don't make sense to us, right? At least initially. And I think much of that confusion is by design. And relatedly, I think Russian hackers are also known for their willingness to experiment with capabilities. This is often associated with malware that's the use of malware that's perhaps not fully mature and that hasn't been tested properly. And particularly, we see that in sort of operations conducted or run by the GRU and the FSB. In the Ukraine conflict, we saw how in Destroyer 2, this is perhaps the most sophisticated operation that we saw as part of this war. But although it was much more targeted than in Destroyer 1, it also showed signs of being deployed too quickly, right? So some of the important parts of the code weren't obfuscated. And then, of course, there was the Viasat hack, which had spillover into other countries, European countries, probably unintentional spillover. And we see that, lack of operational maturity and control in this case as well. And I think Western governments really find this a challenge to deal with, right? Because they try to assess the intent of these operations. That's not always clear. And then the responses to that are not always clear. So perhaps we can also pick that up a little bit in the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Monica. Yes, and then at the end of this introductory remarks, Dr. Devani. You may speak directly. You don't have to activate that. Yeah.
It's already on. Sorry, I failed that initiative test straight off. But thank you very much, everyone. I'm delighted to be on the panel with the other speakers, and also would want to say thank you to Kay and her colleagues for organizing what sort of promises to be a great program of events today. The other panelists have already covered certainly all of the things that I wanted to say, and lots of other much more pertinent things on top of that. So I'll deliberately try to curtail my remarks so that we can have more time for questions. But I just wanted to cover 2 or 3 points. I think the first thing is that I think it's really nice to have a balance between academics and practitioners on the panel. And I think that because, whilst for academics, there's a value in itself to knowledge and understanding. So, better understanding what is happening in cyberspace is a goal in itself. Whereas for practitioners, to sort of paraphrase a philosopher who I'm fairly confident never wrote about cyber, the point isn't simply to understand conflict and competition in cyberspace. It's to use that understanding to shape what happens next. So I think that that there is a definite role there for using the knowledge, the understanding, some of the ideas that come from theorists, from scholars, and to try to apply that in practice. So I think it's a very fruitful area. So it's nice to sort of dramatize that with the composition of the panel. And the second thing that I think is worth saying, picking up from one of the previous speakers, is that I think that there's a danger of the hyperbole of phrases that you will all have heard, whether it's cyber Armageddon, a hacking apocalypse, digital Pearl Harbor or cyber Pearl Harbor. I'm never sure which. I think people say both. fixating on the catastrophic scenarios, I think, can undermine the extent to which you appreciate or recognize the debilitating effect that the persistence of much lower level operations can have. And actually, it is difficult, to deal with that. And people shouldn't trivialize that. So I think that there's a, if you like, the relationship between hyperbole and reality is something that's worth emphasizing or underlining. I know I'm not the first person to say that, but it still goes to say it. The second thing is to say, the subject for this panel is competition and conflict in cyberspace, and they're very important. But I think it's also worth adding, the importance, as other panelists already have said, of cybersecurity and resilience, which is the main theme for the day's discussion. And improving your cybersecurity, improving resilience makes it harder for your adversaries to compete with and to use cyber operations in conflict with you. So it's worth thinking about security and resilience alongside competition and conflict. And the other sort of category that I think it's worth mentioning is cyber diplomacy, which again, what one of the previous speakers has already mentioned, confidence building measures. And it absolutely is the case, this year, that cyber diplomacy is more difficult, arguably, than it's ever been, but it's also more important, even more important than it has been. So, how do states work together on, identifying and binding, those norms of responsible behavior in cyberspace? So that's worth being part of the conversation, as well as talking about competition and conflict. And then just two other things that I think I wanted to mention. One very truncated, because I don't want to repeat what's already been said. Definitely, we've seen a lot of evidence that, if you like, the natural home for cyber operations is this sort of space of competition between states. Whether you're talking about espionage or subversion, misinformation, disinformation, also something that not just me, people call skirmishing, which I think is in that sort of blurred area where competition incrementally becomes more like conflict. And I think for me, I'd say sort of, one of the most dangerous areas to think about is that area of skirmishing, where the question of calibrating the effects that you're trying to achieve and being really reflective about some of the systemic effects or likely sort of unanticipated consequences of what you're trying to do could well, tip that balance. So if people talk about, that moving from competition to conflict, they could talk about a conscious and deliberate choice to use cyber capabilities in the context of conflict, or they could talk about decisions that were made in that competitive space, for example, targeting an adversary's critical infrastructure and perhaps not having the effect that you intended, having an effect that was, more than and different than, and one that you essentially didn't want. So I think thinking about the way that states decide to conduct operations and how reflective they are about the systemic consequences, the second order consequences of them, I think that's a really productive area that a lot of people have been increasingly working on. And then just lastly, and I sort of call that the Goldilocks dilemma, not to trivialize it, but to sort of emphasize it's that question of it being very difficult to get your operational effects just right. How do you know when what you're doing is just enough rather than too much? And I think that's something that I think does pay thinking about. And then lastly, the point of responsible state behavior in cyberspace, or responsible cyber power, which is something that, if you've read or listened to sort of recent speeches over the last few years from UK officials or ministers, cyber power and responsible democratic cyber power is something that they've increasingly talked about as a sort of signature theme or framing concept. And I just sort of throw that out there as a question about, what does that mean in practice? Is it enough to be a responsible power, to abide by international law and the norms of responsible state behavior? Or are there more than one way to interpret what abiding by those norms actually means? So I think there's an interesting, productive, necessary conversation to be had about what the building blocks of responsible behavior are. And you can talk about that in an operational context, sort of an outcomes orientated analysis of judging a responsible power by the consequences that its operations have, not just the direct ones, but maybe the system effects. So you could call that, if you like, the Kantian question of, if all other states universalized your operational behavior, then what would the consequences for cyberspace and for international order be? Or is it enough essentially to sort of behave like a free rider and assume that your actions won't be universalized, but there is value to other states abiding by those norms in a slightly different way than you do. So I think there are questions of consistency, of good faith, and of acting in that broader way that recognizes system effects. So yeah, I sort of wanted to mention that broader context. Those questions about the dilemma of calibrating the effects of your operations, and then that question of responsible cyber power. And I'm happy to stop there.
Well, thank you very much. And I think that we end this part on a very high note, because one of the things that I think that the value of cyber diplomacy is, one of the places where cyber diplomacy has a very high value is precisely on that, because cyber attacks have a high degree of preparation. It's not like you get up and all of a sudden you have the perfectly tailored cyber weapon that you're going to use against a specific target. So I think that, of course, like cyber diplomacy and diplomacy after all, and just promoting good state behavior in cyberspace has a role to play. But I think that what is unique about this panel in this moment in time in which we're gathering to discuss this thing is that when we discuss cyber conflict, whether we don't believe in cyber war and we think it's purely strategic competition, or whether we are on the other side and we think that yes, we're leaving this cyber war because aims have changed greatly, I think that for the first time, defense has the advantage. At least in the case of Ukraine, we can see it very clearly. And I'm going to share with you a couple of data that Mr. Potti was very generous to share with us ahead of the panel. One of them is, for example, attacks on critical infrastructure, which has been named before in this introductory remarks. In Ukraine during 2019 to 2021, there were 5 registered attacks, whereas in the first 3 months of the Russian invasion, 50 were recorded. And I think that the fact that we haven't seen a catastrophe by cyber means when it comes to the energy grid has to do a lot with resilience. And I think that that's an important point to mention, that was like also mentioned in your remarks, Christian, that that cyberspace is an asymmetric domain in which capacities and capabilities play a role. But I think that right now what we're seeing is precisely this preparation and the work you do behind doors to assure resilience. So my first question to the panelists is precisely this: like, knowing that we're in a moment in which the defense is having the advantage, what can we do when it comes to international collaboration and cooperation? What can we learn from these lessons? And if I may, perhaps I would like to start this first round of questions with a question to you, Mr. Potti. Perhaps you want to tell us more of the synchronization of kinetic and cyber attacks, and then from there, you're more than welcome to take the word any of the rest of the people from the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Especially, I prepare a special presentation where we demonstrate different aspects of realization cyber attack of critical infrastructure in Ukraine and government resource. We view different interesting facts. First of all, for example, during the war active invasion, Russian Federation to Ukraine, we view harmonized and common planned cyber attack with conventional kinetic attack. For example, during the attack of Odessa and Lviv region, before this rocket strike, we view cyber attack of local government. For example, in one of the region, we have ransomware attack of local information resource for level of city. I don't know why hackers group encrypted data of local city. Non-financial, no material profit, only tension of social group, because this region have a lot of refugees from another region of Ukraine. The second interesting fact, we have cyber attack, we have peaks of cyber attack, a cyber incident of big social events. For example, 9th Victory Day, very big events and social, political events for Russian Federation, and another peaks of the DOS and phishing attack during the Independence Day of Ukraine. We have clearly a big peak of cyber attack of different government resource, financial resource, Ukraine, and so on. And very interesting narrative and things said my colleague about intentional transition impact of cyber attack, unintentional transition impact of cyber attack during the cyber attack in, for example, Ukraine. But hackers group, when use cyber tools, cyber groups know about escalation attack through the cyberspace and another government resource in another country. Cyber groups know about this, but intentional want it do this cyber attack. This is it's like, for example, clear strike. We nuclear strike in one country, but that person who know about nuclear strike, they know that have pollution in other country, and wanted do this strike. We have maybe don't good example about cyber attack and nuclear strike, but this analog is take place. What we should do during this when we view these facts and so on? In my opinion, we need build a very good cyber resilience civilian sector, cyber resilient private sector, and cyber resilience and government sector. I call this house of cyber resilience, for example, when we roof of this house, different stakeholders of cybersecurity, government, academia, private sectors, and other stakeholders. The columns, this house, we have different cybersecurity teams and good competence, national level, sectoral level, regional level, incident response team, and city level. And fundamental, this cyber resilience house is cyber culture ecosystem about civil society. When we building cyber resilience as a capability, prevention cyber attack and prevention cyber incident, we in future we have a good result to prevent cyber attack, detect cyber attack, response of cyber attack, and recovery our critical infrastructure after the cyber attack. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. I was going to call Monica first because he mentioned one of your like remarks at the beginning, and I'm sure that perhaps you want to compliment what he said, but after that, Christian, you're more than welcome to follow. So you already passed the microphone. I mean, you can take my microphone if you want.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, yes, I completely agree with the issue of these spillover effects. Who knows how intentional or unintentional it is. As I said, I think as part of the strategy here is to divide and confuse. I just wanted to sort of respond to the question a little bit. I'd be a bit careful saying, what we're learning is the defense has the advantage. A little bit of caution there. I think the biggest, lesson from this war and on the cyber front, let's say, excuse the pun, is the power of information sharing and targeted intelligence disclosure. Right, that's been the real sort of edge here. Especially, intelligence disclosure from the US has been absolutely unprecedented. Not only in the lead up to the conventional, the land invasion, but also in terms of malware disclosures. And unfortunately, Juan Andres Guerrero Sade can't be with us today, but I've heard him say that this also has a sort of knock-on effect for the threat intel industry, in that the previous policy or the policy of the United States since roughly 2018 of burning Russian cyber capabilities has had a bit of a knock-on effect in that now threat intelligence is actually finding it difficult to attribute Russian operations to specific groups because they're adapting and changing their tooling. So there is always sort of that side to it. But I think indeed information sharing here with industry, disclosing these tools, we've seen multiple joint advisories put out by the Five Eyes, and I'm sure this has massively contributed to that defense.
I guess it's my turn now. So by training, I'm an infantryman, so I tend to be very simple in my thinking. So to me, there's the 100-meter target, and then there's the 500-meter target. So let me talk about the 100-meter target. I tend to agree with Monica. I think the war is not over yet. When you look back, the retrospective, it might not actually tell you much about what's still ahead. What it does tell you, I think, is that there could be spillover effects. Just as we observed with the KSAT, pay attention to some of the advisories that governments have put out in regards to potential escalation and cyber perhaps being used in order to target critical infrastructure. So we haven't seen all of it yet. I think the story is still to be written, and let's see how things develop. But then sort of moving on to the 500-meter target, I think the sort of the story here is one to me where we need to get out of this ad hocery. What I have learned is that collaboration is possible, partnerships are possible, but like we need to think it through. In other words, everything we do left at the bank needs to become better. And going back to the strategic competition piece and really sort of how this domain is used, we need to do it all at a time. If cyberspace is always on, our collaboration needs to be always on. So that's why, to me, it shouldn't be kind of like the flick of a switch that now let's start talking to industry or now let's start sharing information. That's not the mindset that I think we should have. And I think the key thing going forward, if indeed to accept the premise of a strategic competition, I think is the verb shaping. And shaping, I think, needs to take place at many different levels. Indeed, it needs to take place, going back to the point about the responsible state behavior, it needs to take place at the political level. What is okay, what is not okay, the whole signaling part, but it also needs to take place, by the way, at the technical level. And here I'm talking about the standards. Right. I mean, I think, to a personal opinion, we're a bit late to the game when it comes to some of the standards that are being developed and being proposed. So we also need to start thinking about 10, 20 years ahead of what kind of a technology do we want? What kind of products do we buy? And what kind of incentives does this provide to industry, for example? I mean, we collectively have quite a lot of sort of purchasing power in this regard, in order to sort of make clear that, we're not going to be in the business of buying bad products and creating these vulnerabilities. So there's a role for us to play. And I think sort of, once again, the mindset should be not that of a sort of a passive bystander taking it all in, but actively shaping at many different levels. The political level, yes, indeed, at the technical level, when it comes to the diplomatic game, the kind of the space that we want for ourselves. Because when you go back to and look at our differences of opinion in United Nations Open-Ended Working Group, for example, to me, it's sort of, this passive posture is not necessarily going to bring the kind of the world that I think we want to live in the future. So a much more active posture and out of that ad hocery would be my way of improving that collaboration.
Thank you. I definitely agree with all of that. I mean, just very quickly on the theme of what have we learned, definitely agree. We've learned that, defenders aren't defenseless, particularly when they've got sort of very active partnerships and, partners who are assisting, not just because it's clearly the right thing to do, but also because it's demonstrably in their strategic interest to do it as well. I think we've learned that or reinforced a lesson that I think we probably already knew, which is that achieving effects in cyberspace is hard. It's also difficult to coordinate, delivering effects, in cyber and non-cyber operations that are aligned. And also in conflicts, often, as plenty of people have said, there are often just better ways of achieving effects than through cyber operations. So I think all of those things are not, new objects of learning, but I think they're lessons that are reinforced by what we've seen. I think there's that question of proxies or vigilantes in cyberspace. And I think on the one hand, it's, from an academic perspective, it's really interesting, to see, a proliferation of activity from, vigilante groups, against states. But it's also quite disturbing, what the implications are, and the potential risks involved there, because all things being equal, you can expect states to have pretty mature processes, for deciding on what operations to conduct and how to conduct them, and it's reasonable to assume that ad hoc vigilante collectives will have less mature processes. So there's more potential there, even though the capability may be lower. There's more potential there that through the immaturity of the processes for deciding what to do, that there's the potential risk that might have an escalatory consequence, not least because you have this proliferation of activity in this space that states will want to respond to. It's not reasonable, I think, to expect states to just accept that they will be the victim of an increasing number of sort of vigilante cyber attacks, and how they choose to respond and who they choose to respond against. It's definitely a sort of a question that is worth thinking about very, very closely. And I remember, and I'm sure a lot of you will have read the same article a few months ago, reading about a reported case of a sort of cybersecurity professional, I think, sort of responding against the North Korean state for having been, having been the victim of some kind of cyber operation. You'll know that the story I'm talking about, and I haven't gone any deeper into it than reading that story. But the thing that struck me about it was, on the one hand, there's this tremendously romantic narrative about an individual being able to take action against a state. But on the other hand, do we really want to live in a world where individuals can conduct their own cyber operations against the state? And I really don't think we do. So I think that there's a question there about the impact of those non-state actors, vigilante groups, proxies, call them what you will, on strategic stability. And then I suppose that the last thing I wanted to say about, what have we learned? There's definitely a debate in the UK framed around choices in defense expenditure. And I think you could put it under the umbrella of a quotation. And I forget who said it, but the quotation is, "You can't cyber your way across a river," which is trivially true. I mean, you can't. But what that signifies is a debate about the balance of defense spending in any given country, and whether, in this context, the UK had been emphasizing the role of spending on cyber and emerging technologies too much, and not having focused on non-cyber, more traditional capabilities. And I think my answer to that would be sort of not to draw the wrong lessons. Cyber is important. It will be increasingly important. The UK has set itself some pretty ambitious goals for growing its sort of cyber capabilities, but I don't think they're the wrong goals. And I think, they're feasible, achievable, potentially desirable, depending on how they're put into practice. But there is a separate question there within a sort of a finite amount of resources that you have to spend on defense about the choices you make in other areas. So I recognize that there are a series of hard decisions and they're interconnected, but I hope that we don't draw the lesson that investing in cyber is wrong, because I think that would definitely emphatically be the wrong lesson.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to ask any of the panelists if you have any responses to the remarks for the rest of the colleagues. Otherwise, I will go to the audience and go ahead with questions. We have a few minutes left still. Sure, go ahead.
Hello. Good morning to you all. My name is Nicholas Ott. I work for Microsoft. I have a question to the four of you, because I feel there's a little bit too much harmony amongst you. We need a little bit more controversy here. And I would like to just go back to the very name of this panel and ask ourselves, are we doing ourselves a favor in being stuck in a mindset that's not actually reflecting sort of what we see in the reality? I mean, in your remarks, many of you have already reflected upon persistent engagement, about the contested space, but how much does this actually resonate within capitals, within discussions? Quite often we have the impression that within sort of the environment of like-minded thinkers. We're kind of realizing that this is sort of a campaign-based environment, but how much are we getting this narrative across to the ones who have to reconsider how we actually approach this environment? Because ultimately, while we do great talking and having conferences like this, others are acting and proceeding. So I'd love to get just thoughts on this and see how each of you think about this. Thanks.
After this, if you have any more questions, we're gonna get like a couple of more questions, and then like we will move on to the coffee break. So while the panelists respond to this, please think about yours.
I guess I'll kick us off. It's sort of major heat here, and then it's off to the rest of the group. Well, but it's also on the academic side, right? I mean, I also want to understand, like, how should we think about it? I've seen all kinds of proposals and all kinds of different ways of how to think about. Yes, you have the persistent engagement thinking that's out there, right? Richard Parknet and Emily Goldman and the rest of it. You have, deterrence by entanglement from Joe Nye, puncture deterrence, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we're all trying to sort of understand also from a theoretical point of view, what is the right framework for describing what's happening in that space, and what are the sort of the best ways how to, well, at least from a practitioner's point of view, how to like posture ourselves and the kind of capabilities we should have and the rest of it. And I think it's sort of evolving over time. And let me give you an interesting example. I was there in 2007, sort of when the Estonian cyber attacks took place. And we did some things also at the political level. When I look back at 2007 and compare this to what is happening right now, well, it's like a night and day. A lot has happened. So I think in a situation where the domain itself is changing, there are new vulnerabilities and new technologies that are being used. I think in many ways our thinking sort of evolves together with the domain. And there's, I think, hesitancy in terms of sort of coming up with the answer, with the silver bullet that, we have it now. And when it comes to sort of nailing yourself to a cross that, we've solved the problem. I think it's an ongoing discussion all the time. Going back to the previous point, also sort of how do we chew gum and walk at the same time, right? I mean, how do we do the big D&D, defense and deterrence, all of the capabilities, and what's sort of cyber role in this regard? Because at one point, indeed, you need to spend money. And if you don't spend money, you will not have capabilities. You probably will not be managing risk appropriately. So this is me telling you that I guess we continue to have this discussion all the time. And I don't really sort of see that there's somebody that says that, aha, I have figured it out. We haven't. I think my answer would be we evolve together with the domain. And really, let's go back to what sort of all of the decisions that NATO has made, what BCM, what Rick was also talking about. I mean, quite often, like NATO as an organization, how should I put it? It is not necessarily revolutionary. It reacts to sort of the developments on the threat landscape. Really, so it's the threat that quite often has sort of forced us to make decisions that we have made. It's not out of choice, but out of necessity. Reacting to events that are out there. So if this is me telling you that if somebody tells you that they have it and they have the sort of the magic sauce, they probably don't. They're just selling stuff to you. And this is me telling you also that we're still thinking through, and many of the decisions that we have, I suppose, will be challenged at one point.
Thank you. I definitely would look to Christian for an answer to that question. So I'm not going to claim that I know what policymakers are thinking, but certainly from the perspective of academia, how much of these concepts filtering through, I think a lot. There's a lot of criticism of the cyber war pundits that you encounter. I want to know who these cyber war pundits are, because it's not a thing, right? It's become a straw man argument. So I think these concepts are filtering through. I mean, I think from where I stand, I live in the Netherlands, I'm British, I have a lot of interaction with the US policymakers. I mean, certainly these concepts are used, it's generally accepted, the reaction you sort of get, well, this is obvious, right? Below the threshold of war is where cyber matters most at the most basic level. So I think there is that shared understanding. I did a lot of research also on Israel. And interestingly, they sort of said, well, we've known this for years. You know, we have the concept of Mabam, the war between wars. That's where cyber is most useful. So yeah, I think from my standpoint, yeah, that is filtering through.
Yeah, I mean, again, sort of, you know, in line with the first comment you made, I mean, I wouldn't disagree with any of that. I mean, I think I just focus on some of the incentives and the outputs rather than I think the outcomes, which is the more important bit of your question, and I think just deserves a slower and more deliberate answer than I can kind of give right now. On the academic side, I think probably if you think about traditional incentives and, you know, producing and being judged on, you know, peer-reviewed publications that wouldn't in themselves likely change, you know, behavior in the real world. So, you know, how you capture what academics try to do to achieve, you know, impact, you know, through the research that they produced. And I think that is getting better. Probably that you know, it could be improved still about, you know, how you weigh, you know, what academics do in that space to try to achieve, you know, public policy impacts. But I do think that, you know, that there is a sort of a good faith effort to do that. And on the practitioner side, I think it's definitely the case, you know, and sort of talking about outputs now, like the conversation about cyber strategy is a lot richer. There's a lot more of it, you know, than there was 10 years ago. You know, just recently, sort of just in relation to something that I've sort of recently co-written, that's about discussion or debate about UK cyber strategy. You know, that just exists on a kind of a different plane, really, to what it did 10 years ago, because there are more voices out there, you know, talking, you know, about the implications of these choices, you know, for the UK in a way that, you know, if you literally go back 10 years or 12 years, there just wasn't. So I think things are getting better in terms of the quantity and the quality of the conversation. But I take your point that there's a separate question about, you know, what are the outcomes? What's the impact or the effect of that? And I think that, you know, that's really important, and hopefully, you know, the increasing amount of quality of the conversation will shape, you know, the effects. But no, that's a really good question.
And very short things. Good sentence when we have a good conference today, and other guys do it, cyber attack, cyber incident, search another way how invasion different networks, different system and so on. But I have another question. Why they do it? What motivation do it? Maybe I represent the academic sector too. I am professor. I represent the military sector because I am brigadier general. I represent the government because today I work in my government on my own. But every day I think, what motivation do it hackers attacks? What motivation invasion to network, another network, and stolen information about citizen, about receipt, and other information? Why? But for example, for me, this is not interesting. Where do you live? Where do you work? What information we collect in your smartphone, on a standalone computer, and the cooperative system? For me, not interesting. I have another motivation. I have built resilient structure in my country and work of my citizens, and write scientific articles with my colleague, for example. What motivation these young people in different groups do it? And today I have another question. How prevent this motivation? Not prevent impact, prevent cyber attack. How prevent motivation do it? Maybe we today return to conception of cyber deterrence, because this conception today don't good work, I know. Maybe we have another way to broke this motivation. Maybe today, my government very close work with private company, Microsoft, Asset, Mandiant, and so on. This is a good company for threat intelligence and so on. Maybe today we need construct a good instrument, threat intelligence, attribution, and after this, a good attribution and good prosecution these guys, and give implement against these guys prosecution method on different method of prosecution, legal sanction, juridical, economical sanction, physical sanction, juridical sanction, and so on. Maybe this is a good way for prevent motivation, do it doing hackers attacks. Today, I don't find a good answer on this question. But every day, my government, my military and civilian staff, with your staff from private company, different country, and staff from different governments, different countries, Great Britain, USA, and so on. Every day we had a very big hard work to prevent this is a bad action. Maybe these young people who broke our system go to another work, then work in stolen information, destroy database, and so on. Finally, during the from the 2014, we have day and day we have cyber attack of critical infrastructure, energy, you know, black energy, not petty, and so on. Cyber attacks. When today, when Russia Federation understand that cyber attacks not have a big catastrophic impact of critical infrastructure Ukraine, because we have a good resilience, and today we very hard work for cyber resilience. Russian Federation go missile strike of critical infrastructure, more effective path, broke critical infrastructure, simple destroy, physical destroyed. We Russian Federation physical destroyed electric power station with database, SCADA system, IKS, and so on. Physical destroyed our data center, cloud operators. Physical destroyed electronic register. Very simple way. Go to rocket, building destroy, server destroy, electric power destroy, and we have a good result today. So very big problem. Why these guys do it a bad hackers attack during the EPs? I don't understand why this do it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, I think we don't have much time for questions, but we're moving on to a coffee break right now. So I would encourage that if you have any further question, you would approach our speakers here, and then I'm sure they will be delighted to respond to you. But before moving on, I want to say a couple of things. First of all, thank you very much to each and every one of you for your insights and your remarks, and for being so collaborative, if I may say, on the topic. And after that, just like a slightly reminder, after the coffee break, we're going to move on to the breakout sessions. So if you're in session number 2 about cyber security and emerging and disruptive technologies, go to room 312. And if you're in session number 1 about cyber resilience and cyber defense, move to room 311.